Good evening, and thank you for joining us for our final Bridge Builders program of the year. Bridge Builders Conversations with Interesting People is presented by the Clinton Foundation and sponsored by Colson Oil. I'd like to give a very special thank you to Beth and Mike Colson and Colson Oil for sponsoring this series this year, and I'm pleased to announce that the Colsons have graciously agreed to sponsor Bridge Builders in 2021 as well. I'm Stephanie Street, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation. Tonight, we are joined by two distinguished guests. Alphonso David, President of the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest LGBTQ civil rights organization, and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Jonathan Capehart. Alphonso David is an accomplished and nationally recognized LGBTQ civil rights lawyer and advocate. He has been at the forefront of the movement for LGBTQ equality for more than a decade at both the state and national level. He is the first civil rights lawyer and the first person of color to serve as president of HRC in the organization's 40-year history. Alphonso, we are honored to have you with us this evening. I'm also delighted that we are joined tonight by my friend, Jonathan Capehart. Jonathan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a member of the Washington Post editorial board, and the host of the fabulous podcast, Cape Up. And I'm so excited that beginning this weekend, Jonathan will host The Sunday Show with Jonathan Capehart every Sunday from 10 to 12 Eastern Time on MSNBC. Congratulations, Jonathan. I'd also like to give a shout out to my former White House colleague and Clinton administration alumni, Richard Socarides, who I know is tuning in tonight. Richard served as senior advisor to President Clinton during the Clinton administration and was his principal advisor on gay and lesbian civil rights issues. Thanks, Richard. Tonight, we are fortunate to hear about the impactful work of the Human Rights Campaign. HRC strives to end discrimination against LGBTQ people and realize a world that achieves fundamental fairness and equality for all. HRC envisions a world where lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people are ensured equality and embraced as full members of society at home, at work, and in every community. And while we have made some significant strides, the journey is still long and full of many hurdles. Jonathan and Alphonso will discuss the status of LGBTQ equality on the national, regional, and local level. Sadly, as many of you know, Arkansas is one of only 3 states without hate crimes legislation. Currently, a bill has been filed here in Arkansas that will be taken up during the legislative session that begins in January. However, it will face significant challenges. Stay tuned, as we will need everyone to reach out to members of the Arkansas General Assembly about this critical legislation. Thank you all again for tuning in throughout the year for this series, and especially tonight for what I know will be a timely and important discussion. I'll now turn this over to you, Jonathan, to begin our conversation.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Very nice to see you again. Thank you for the invitation to be here to moderate this conversation. Thank you to the Clinton Foundation also for the invitation to be here. And I think I should use this time to invite Alphonso David to be here, to be on screen. Alphonso, always great to see you, and always great to get your insights. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It is really good to see you again. Congratulations on your new show, your new MSNBC show. We are so excited to have you debut your show this Sunday. So great to see you.
Thank you very much for those kudos. And also thank you, Stephanie, for the kudos as well on the new show. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm really excited. But we're not here to talk about me or my show. We're here to talk about you, about HRC, Human Rights Campaign, and about the state of LGBTQ Americans going forward in the twilight of the President Trump's term and the advent of the Biden-Harris administration. Stephanie mentioned what's happening in Arkansas and the lack of a hate crimes bill. And so let's start right there. There's been a lot of talk in Arkansas about passing a hate crimes legislation. And from what I understand, HRC has had staff on the ground in Arkansas, Alabama, and Mississippi since 2014. How are you engaging on this piece of legislation? And what would Arkansas passing a hate crimes bill mean for the other southern states?
Well, thank you for that, Jonathan. Arkansas, as you just referenced, has the unfortunate distinction of being one of only 3 states without the hate crimes law. The governor of Arkansas, as well as the current president pro tem of the state Senate, both Republicans, by the way, have been strong supporters. So much so that Senator Hendren is the main sponsor of the bill. If Arkansas can pass hate crimes legislation, I think that it will be a clear indicator to even the most partisan states, Southern or not, that we are coming around to the right side of history. It's going to be a tough fight, and I'm calling on everyone to really join us in Arkansas tonight. Those who are watching, those who are participating in our electoral process, in our legislative process, to please call your state senator, call your state representative, and encourage them to vote on this critical piece of legislation. We have been in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Alabama for a number of years now. And the goal was to really take a step back and think about, how do we affect cultural change? How do we actually get people to see LGBTQ people as human beings, as entitled and deserving of the same protections as everyone else? So our staff have been doing extraordinary work. We're hopeful that we will be able to get this piece of legislation passed. And as I noted a few minutes ago, it'll be a sea change for some of the most partisan states, that we can actually move forward with progressive pieces of legislation.
Okay, so since we're talking about southern states, let's talk about some of these southern states that have been doing real numbers on the LGBTQ community. You have North Carolina, which passed HB2, which discriminates against the transgender community in public accommodations. Mississippi passed, HB 1523, which would allow the use of religion as a justification for discrimination against LGBTQ Mississippians at work, school, and in their communities. And then, of course, there's Texas, which year after year is one of the leaders in anti-LGBTQ legislation. Why is the South focused on attacking LGBTQ people?
Well, I wish I could say that bad bills were just concentrated in the South. But throughout my years of experience, I've seen the South present some of the trickiest waters for us to navigate. And I wish that there was a simple answer. One answer might be religious institutions and the subversion of religion to affect individual rights. But I've also seen churches, including parishioners and entire denominations actually, serve some of our strongest allies. Another answer might be just the politics. I think we're living in an incredibly partisan time where it's either A or B, and people are not really seeing some of the collateral consequences of how their policies are affecting the lives of marginalized communities. I hope that we are able to pass the hate crimes law in Arkansas, but I also think that we have to do a lot of work, because in the South, unfortunately, LGBTQ people and other marginalized communities have been demonized and marginalized for decades. And we have to do the cultural change work. We have to make sure it's not about one election. It's not about, one piece of legislation. It's about making sure that we have those difficult conversations. There are many people who have never met a transgender person. And if that changes, that affects how they see, a transgender person's rights as it relates to, whether or not they have the right to be free of discrimination. If they don't, unfortunately, we're still viewed as the other. And I think that's one of the major obstacles that we face in the South.
So, well, then what is HRC's strategy to help make the South more inclusive for the LGBTQ community?
Well, one is, once again, engaging in that cultural change work, working year in, year out, having boots on the ground to make sure that people communicate with us and they understand that we're just like them. We are looking for the same rights and protections as they are. So we have staff embedded in these states. Second, we're working with elected officials and candidates for local office to make sure that they also have an opportunity to represent the interests of their constituents. And when we do that, we change the landscape. Mondaire Jones, as an example, or Sarah McBride, These are folks who just won their elections only a few weeks ago, and they are trailblazers because Sarah McBride is now becoming the first transgender senator in any state. We have Mondaire Jones, Richie Torres, who will be the first Afro-Latino and first Black congresspeople to serve ever in the history of this country. So when we can work with elected officials and candidates for office to change the landscape and also invest in cultural change work, we can advance LGBTQ progress, and that's what we're doing.
Okay, and I do want to talk more. I have more specific questions about transgender issues and transgender policies. But let's have the conversation, Alphonso, the cultural conversation. This happened during the Democratic primary when Mayor Pete Buttigieg was running, openly gay, a super successful campaign, and a lot of the talk was, oh, well, the reason why Mayor Pete isn't getting support from African Americans is because he's gay. Let's have this conversation. From your vantage point, as the leader of the nation's largest and most influential LGBTQ rights organization, talk to people out there who still believe that African Americans, that Black people, sort of have ownership over homophobia in this country.
That's a really good way to frame it. Black people in this country are not opposed to LGBTQ equality. Quite the opposite. We actually conducted a survey and worked with other organizations as well to actually look at this issue. And the results are very different. We have more than 70% of people of faith, largely Black, Latino, and the like, who actually support ensuring that LGBTQ people are free from discrimination, and they support policies that can protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. So the idea that Black people or people of faith actually don't support LGBTQ equality is just false. We also have data that shows that the majority of people in this country support the Equality Act. They would support legislation that would protect LGBTQ people from discrimination. There's a false trope here that we're seeing, and we've seen all over this country, but this false trope that we've seen peddled over the past election season, which is if you're Black or if you're Latinx, you're anti-LGBTQ. And that's simply not true. The data directly contradicts that contention.
I'm nodding my head because I know what you're saying is true. I've written about it. And you and I have talked about this many times, and you know how it makes my blood boil. But I asked that question the way I asked it, because we do have a question from Clifton, who asks, how can I work toward LGBTQ acceptance in a rural conservative area with a high percentage of African Americans?
Talk to them.
That's simple. Yeah.
It's really, I'll tell you, we have to recognize that our policies are driven to a large degree by fear. And we have to change that. How do we change that? Policy should not be driven by fear. It should actually be driven by fact. It should be driven by data. And unfortunately, so much of our policies and so much of our politics are driven by fear. So if you're living in a rural area, and if you can come out, if it's safe for you to come out, because that's important, come out. If you're able to engage with people so they know that you're LGBTQ, that changes the dynamic. You may be interfacing with people who have never met an LGBTQ person. And when they do, it humanizes LGBTQ. Otherwise, it's just simply a label. So as we think about cultural change, it's so important for us to engage in the individual advocacy work that we all have to do.
So you've mentioned the Equality Act a couple of times. So talk about the Equality Act and why, well, one, what it is, and then what it would do really for the LGBT community.
So the Equality Act is a piece of federal legislation, and this proposal would provide comprehensive protections to LGBTQ people all over this country. In 29 states in this country, we do not have comprehensive protections for LGBTQ people. So you may say, well, what does that really mean? What that means is me, as a Black man and as a gay man, I could go into a department store to purchase a new shirt or a pair of jeans, and I could face discrimination because I'm Black or because I'm gay. And there is no federal law that would prohibit discrimination on either basis. In addition, I could jump into an Uber or into a Lyft to travel to the store, to visit a family member. And that driver could say, get out of my car if they hear me on the phone or if I say something regarding LGBTQ. There is no protection under federal law for LGBTQ people in transportation hubs. So the Equality Act would change that. It would provide comprehensive protections for LGBTQ people in employment, housing, public accommodations, credit, education, jury service. We don't have those comprehensive protections, and that's why this piece of legislation is so critical.
Recently, the Supreme Court ruled in Bostock v. Clayton County, and some say it's the most important legal decision regarding LGBT rights in the United States, along with Lawrence v. Texas and Obergefell v. Hodges. What do you think Bostock did for the LGBTQ community?
Bostock did a number of things, I think. Bostock reminded or increased awareness, I should say, for people all over this country. Many people assumed that LGBTQ people were protected under federal civil rights laws. And the Bostock question was 3 employers fired LGBTQ employees after they came out or after they discovered they were LGBTQ. And each of those employers argued that they had the right to fire those employees and they would have no liability under federal law. That was the question before the court. Are LGBTQ people protected under federal civil rights laws? And the court said yes. And so I think one of the really critical things that court decision did was increase the level of awareness that there was questions about whether or not we were protected. The second is the court decision said, in cases where federal statutes prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, it should also be interpreted to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, which is significant because, as you know, Jonathan, there are other federal statutes that say you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So the Bostock decision should be interpreted to prohibit discrimination in other spheres as well. The Trump administration has not interpreted it that way, which is why we're working with the Biden administration to make sure that there is a consistent interpretation of Bostock.
And that was what was so important about the Bostock decision, is what it said about sexual orientation and gender identity. One, transgender Americans being talked to and protected by the United States Supreme Court, one, and two, this particular Supreme Court, which by then already had a conservative majority, not the big majority it has now. But given the way you explained the Bostock decision, why is the Equality Act still needed?
The Equality Act is still needed because there are areas of protection, I should say, that don't exist under federal law. So as an example, what I mentioned before, a jury service or public accommodation or transportation hubs, there are instances where we could interpret the Bostock decision consistent with the court's ruling, but there are no state or federal laws that could protect LGBTQ people. And so the other reason, in addition to making sure that we have comprehensive protections, we want to enshrine our protections in statute. We do not want to rely on a court interpretation that may potentially be challenged again in the future. And with a new conservative majority, we do have concerns about the limitations that could be placed on the Bostock decision.
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way, because it dovetails nicely with the question I have here from Chris, member of the audience, who asks, I'm concerned about recent changes to the Supreme Court and how LGBTQ plus rights may be impacted. What can I do as a concerned citizen to help protect everyone's right to marriage?
Well, first, we need to fight at the local level to ensure that we have comprehensive protections for LGBTQ people. As I said before, in 29 states in this country, we don't have comprehensive protections. for LGBTQ people. As it relates to marriage equality, unfortunately, that question will likely be posed before the court in the near future. And the question will be whether or not marriages between same-sex couples should have certain restrictions placed on it. When I say restrictions, I mean restrictions. And what the questions that are going to be presented to the court, I believe, will be whether people of religious faith can discriminate against same-sex couples when they seek to marry or receive services associated with their marriage. We will be fighting those cases because we don't believe our marriages should be considered skim milk marriages.
Mm-hmm.
And that
to quote RBG, the late RBG.
I mean, you think about whole milk versus skim milk. If I, as a gay man, go to the store or go to rent a hall, and I say I would like to rent this hall in order to have my marriage ceremony, and they say yes, but once they find out I'm going to marry a man, they say no, that means that my marriage is not equal. And so we're going to be fighting. If that case does present itself to the court, we're going to be fighting. But what I think this person can do is fight at the local level, contact your elected officials to make sure they understand how important it is. We have to fight legislatively, but we also have to fight in the court of public opinion to make sure people are aware that our marriages should not be devalued because someone is trying to, quote, exercise their religious exemption.
You know, one of the more shocking things in a tenure that's been filled with shocking things, that I remember being on the train from Washington to New York one morning and just working on a column, catching up on the papers, and I saw a tweet from the President of the United States that made me audibly gasp on the train. And that was the tweet where he demanded that the military ban transgender troops from serving in the military. He did this just a few months in to his administration. Multiple lawsuits have proceeded on this, and the Supreme Court has permitted implementation of this ban while there are cases challenging what the president did. What's HRC doing to ensure that our transgender troops can serve openly in the military?
We're doing two things. One, the Human Rights Campaign joined a federal lawsuit as a plaintiff on behalf of our members and supporters to challenge the Trump administration's discriminatory policy. And that lawsuit, of course, is still working its way through the courts. The second thing that we're doing is working directly with the Biden-Harris administration to make sure that we can repeal that discriminatory regressive policy. It can't be that you're a transgender person, you pay taxes, you contribute to this society, but you can't serve your country. There is no legitimate basis for excluding transgender people from serving in the military. So we're working with the Biden-Harris administration to really repeal that policy. And we, at all points, are suggesting to us that they are certainly supportive of repealing that policy. I believe that President-elect Biden has said that publicly, and we're hopeful that that's going to happen very soon in his new term.
Just to clear things up, the policy that President Trump put in place was an executive order. It was not a law, a bill that came from Congress to his desk and signed into law. This is something that actually President-elect, once he is fully President of the United States, he can reverse?
He can reverse. So President Trump effectively used two levers to advance discriminatory policies. He would issue executive orders that to a large extent were unconstitutional and discriminatory, and his federal agencies would advance regulations and policies to strip away protections from LGBTQ people. We believe that Vice President-elect Biden has the full authority to rescind that executive order. When new presidents come into office, they review all existing executive orders and determine whether or not to continue those executive orders. This is one executive order that should not continue.
One of the things that you've been very vocal about since becoming president of HRC, and you even talked about it in your inaugural address at the big fall dinner, was the crisis of murder of transgender women of color. I think you have, since 2013, HRC and other organizations have recorded at least 202 transgender and gender nonconforming people who are victims of fatal violence in the United States since 2013, 40 having been murdered this year alone in 2020, higher than any year from what I understand. What's HRC doing to combat this? And what can cities and communities do to protect the transgender community?
Thank you for that question, Jonathan. And before I talk about what cities can do and what HRC is doing, I just want to sort of underscore what you just said. This is an epidemic. We have transgender people in this country that are being killed for simply being who they are. And it's not showing up on the front pages of the newspaper. They're loving partners and parents and family members and friends and community members. They contribute to our society, and yet they're being killed for being who they are. In Arkansas, for example, Brayla Stone, 17 years old, Black transgender girl, murdered in Little Rock over the summer. So we have to all actively engage in addressing this epidemic of violence. At the Human Rights Campaign, I announced a transgender justice initiative soon after I started. The initiative focuses on economic empowerment and access to employment, increasing the capacity of trans-led and transgender-focused organizations, addressing stigma that relates to the trans community. We just announced a PSA with Warner Media, and the purpose of that PSA was to really make sure we are able to communicate the validity of the lives of transgender people who live in this country. With respect to what people can do locally, I would say, look at the recent pledge that we issued. We issued a public pledge asking local officials to take steps, affirmative steps, to address the plight of violence involving transgender people. Look to see whether or not your elected official is signing on to that pledge, and make sure if they're not, ask them why.
You know, one of the things earlier when you were talking about the community, and you were saying to, especially folks who live in rural areas, if it's safe, come out and tell your stories, because it's when we tell our stories that we humanize us as people, but we humanize the community. The community no longer becomes a stranger. Over the last at least 30 years, because of popular television shows like Will and Grace and others, the American people got to know the L, the G, and the B. But it's the T piece that has been, I think it was Laverne Cox was the one who talked about how the T in LGBT was silent, and that she wasn't going to be silent anymore. I think maybe, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm very happy to be pushed back on and to be educated, but how can we get the American people, our culture writ large, to get over either the stigma that they associate with being transgender, or the bigoted notions that they might not even know are bigoted notions about the transgender community? What more can be done? What's going to be the Will and Grace moment, or extended moment, for the transgender community, where that community is demystified in the way that the L, the G, and the B had been demystified over a long period of time, but in such a way that more people came around to accepting the L, the G, and the B?
That's a great question. You know, given where we are culturally, I don't know that there is one answer. You know, a number of years ago, decades ago, we had certain means of obtaining information, and television was incredibly influential in terms of affecting culture and changing culture. Now we're getting our information from so many different sources, and in some cases, people are getting the information that they want to hear. Mm-hmm. They're getting the information that sort of validates their ideology, so much so that they don't even know about the 40 or so transgender people who've been killed, because they're getting their information and quote news from sources that ignore that reality. So I think part of the challenge that we have moving forward is, once again, to see how we can come out to the extent we can, and also see beyond ourselves. This is a part of the speech that I gave last year. If we as LGBT people understand that our quest for liberation is directly tied to the quest for liberation for transgender people and gender nonconforming people, then we can actually achieve liberation. A perfect example is the Bostock case. The Bostock case, one of the cases was brought by a transgender woman. But the key question before the court wasn't whether or not transgender people are protected by federal civil rights laws. It was whether or not LGBTQ people are. And there were 3 cases, of course, but if we can see that our quest for liberation is intricately tied to the quest for liberation for transgender and gender nonconforming people, it'll be a sea change, because there are LGBT people in positions of power who have access. And if they're able to actually open the door a little wider to allow transgender people to participate in this fight for liberation, then we can actually have real change. And that's what we're fighting for, to really change hearts and minds where people can see themselves in the Black transgender people that are being killed.
And you know, when you gave that speech and you talked about the very thing that you were talking about, one of the things I wondered was, wow, how is this going over in an organization that is overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male, and had as its focus for many, many years, because it was the #1 issue the community wanted to work on, generally speaking, was marriage. How did it go over the new president coming forward and saying, look beyond yourselves?
I think, well, 2 things I'll say in response to that. I think you're absolutely correct. The organization has historically been predominantly white and male, but that has changed. And it's changed quite dramatically over the past few years. Not so much that the majority of people are racial minorities or so, or transgender people, but the demographics are changing within the organization. I've also worked to really change the composition of the board and attract marginalized groups within the LGBTQ community to serve as board members. And we've been actually quite successful in doing that. To answer your direct question, I did receive some negative feedback with respect to that challenge, where some didn't really understand or appreciate how important it was for them to see beyond themselves. Because I believe that ultimately, our quest for liberation cannot be focused on those who are the most privileged. Because if we do that, we will never really get to the core issue that's undermining our quest for liberation. What's undermining our quest for liberation, that bias, that prejudice, that discrimination, is not really tied to your privilege. It's tied to our identity. And if we're able to affect the most marginalized, we're able to actually transform our culture in a way that's sustainable. And although I did receive some sort of concern, I received overwhelming support from people all over the country. And it was heartwarming to see that, in spite of the fact that there were some people who just couldn't see it. And I'll close by saying this. I see that as an opportunity, Jonathan. The folks who say no, the folks who reject that narrative, the folks who are unable to see beyond themselves are the folks who I want to talk to. Because if we can break that code, we can also potentially break the code of the 73 million people who voted for Trump, despite COVID-19, despite discrimination, despite the racial unrest. And that's what I see as the opportunity for the future.
And of the 73, 10 million of the 73 million were new voters added on to what he won in 2016. I have a question from Lonnie, who asks, as an educator, how can I better advocate for my transgender students, especially our Black trans females, and my students who identify as they and them?
Doing just that, advocating. Teachers have a lot of power. And if you can express how important it is that all students are treated fairly, and all students should have the protections, regardless of who they are, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, it will make change. It will affect change. And if you need help, please contact us. We work with school districts all over the country. We have a program called Welcoming Schools, where we work with school districts to provide curriculums that are actually inclusive. We have programs. We have a Time to Thrive, which is a program that we air every single year, where we identify LGBTQ kids and elevate them and talk about their experiences so that they can sort of communicate with other LGBTQ kids who may be facing challenges. So please continue to engage in advocacy and contact us. hrc.org, reach out to us if you need support, and we will certainly be more than helpful to provide you with support.
Can we talk about the two epidemics that are stalking the country, HIV, the AIDS epidemic, and COVID? And I want to start with HIV and AIDS, because both President Trump and President-elect Biden have talked about the goal of eradicating the HIV epidemic in the United States within 10 years. And I know HIV has been long a priority for you, and especially for HRC, since being named president of HRC. So what is the organization doing to reduce new HIV infections? And do you believe we can actually end the HIV epidemic in the United States within 10 years?
Yes, I'll answer the second question first. We absolutely can. HIV, unfortunately, continues to be a public health crisis, both here in this country and globally. There remains no vaccine, no cure, and tens of thousands of people continue to contract HIV every year. And Jonathan, what incenses me is that many people believe that HIV is, quote, dead, that people are not contracting HIV anymore, that you can take PrEP, which is, a medication that you can take to prevent or protect you from contracting HIV. But unfortunately, that's not the case in many Black and Brown communities. 1 out of 2 Black men who are gay or bisexual will contract HIV in their lifetime. 1 out of 4 Latinx men who are gay or bisexual will contract HIV in their lifetime. So part of what we're doing is making sure that we increase awareness in communities of color that are more exposed to contracting HIV, and making sure that we're educating the public about prevention, making sure that we're addressing some of the cultural issues that are affecting Black and Brown communities, because we have to do more, and we can't also assume that everyone has access to healthcare. PrEP is great, but many people don't have access to healthcare. So we're working to sort of advance or remove some of the barriers, I should say, that exist for many Black and Brown communities.
And so that's HIV. Now let's talk about COVID and some of the issues facing the LGBTQ community related to COVID.
COVID impacts the LGBTQ community in ways that people don't fully appreciate. I'll say that 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people live in poverty. 1 out of 5 LGBTQ people have not seen a doctor because they cannot afford one. More than 40% of LGBTQ people work in industries that were disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And if you're Black or if you're Brown, those numbers are even worse. And what we've done is we've issued these studies, research studies, and with an objective of not only educating the public on how LGBTQ people are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, but importantly, informing and educating policymakers. Policymakers are in the seats of really creating the solutions to COVID-19. And we want them to be well-informed as to how COVID-19 is disproportionately impacting the LGBTQ community. So when they create solutions to COVID-19 or advanced packages, whether they be economic or healthcare packages, that they are aware of how to address the community because they're aware of the disproportionate impact that COVID is having.
As you were talking about, and you rattled off the statistics about the numbers of our community living in poverty, no access to healthcare, and it made me think, there's this perception, and maybe I'm just going to blame Will and Grace for this perception, for all the good it did in terms of humanizing the community. It also stamped the community with the perception that the gay community is wealthy. Well, one, the gay community is white and wealthy, but the emphasis on the gay community is wealthy. And so what can be done to burst that perception and bring forth the reality that the LGBTQ community actually lives within those really horrifying statistics that you just laid out.
Part of what we can and should do, and what we're doing at the Human Rights Campaign, is looking very intentionally on how we communicate and what images we're using to communicate about the LGBTQ experience. One of the things I said to my staff when I first started was, I want us to be incredibly intentional when we're issuing a press release or we're creating a new initiative. What images are we using? Which images are we using? Because those images, unfortunately, are used to reflect the community and perpetuate the perception that LGBTQ people are white and male, and we're not. We are an incredibly diverse community, and unfortunately, people assume that we're wealthy. So I think one of the most important things we can do is really be more intentional on how we engage in education and outreach efforts. The second thing we can do, and which is what we've been working on with the Biden-Harris administration, is making sure that when we talk about LGBTQ issues, we are also talking about LGBTQ issues from the perspective of marginalization. Where are people marginalized? How are people marginalized? I talk about people who are multiply marginalized. A Black man without access to healthcare with HIV, a transgender woman who's Latinx, fearful for her life, an asylee seeker who's a lesbian seeking being persecuted in her home country, seeking asylum in this country. People are operating under regressive and oppressive policies, and they have multiple identities, and those identities don't function well in this culture. So when we think about creating policy, how do we create policy in a way that actually gets to the core of the problem, is what I think what we need to do more effectively than we unfortunately were able to do with the Trump administration, and I think we will with the Biden-Harris administration.
And so let's talk about the Biden-Harris administration. What can we expect from President Biden and Vice President Harris when it comes to the campaign promises they made to the LGBTQ community?
You're right. The Biden-Harris campaign had robust LGBTQ policy agendas, and many of those policy issues we endorsed. What we've worked on over the past few months, I would say, starting in the spring, we started developing a blueprint for positive change. The blueprint includes 85 policy and administrative recommendations. And we've advanced those recommendations to the Biden-Harris administration. They include, as we've talked about, making sure that the Bostock decision is implemented across all federal agencies. But we're also asking for other things like ending conversion therapy as a fraudulent business practice. Many people don't know this, but in many parts of this country, if you come out as LGBTQ, your parents could potentially subject you to conversion therapy, which in other words is shock therapy. It's junk science, has been rejected by the American Medical Association, but still allowed in some states. So we're asking the Biden administration to really end this practice as a fraudulent business activity. We're also looking to create an interagency working group on the epidemic of violence that's affecting the transgender community. We're looking to end some of the policies that were advanced during the Trump administration. So I'm anticipating not only a rescission of the Trump policies, but also some affirmative policies to advance LGBTQ equality forward.
We are running out of time, and I got two questions to ask you. One, I mean, anyone who didn't know you before will not forget you after this conversation. I can't believe the time is almost up. But as a leader in the LGBTQ community and the leader of the Human Rights Campaign, again, the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization in the country, where do you see the LGBTQ movement in the next 10 years?
Not where we are now. I think that we're going to make some significant changes over the next 10 years globally. And what I want to do is really affect policy change at the local level and the federal level and get people to see us as human beings, not aliens, not deviants, but actually human beings. And it sounds somewhat simplistic to frame it that way, but that's what we need to do. The policies that are being advanced in some states to take away rights from LGBTQ people is being driven by one fact: fear, where they don't see us as people. They don't see us as human beings. And if they do, they certainly don't see us as entitled to the same rights, privileges, and protections as they are. How do we change that? I want to sort of deconstruct the systems that we've been operating in and really look at its core, how LGBTQ people have been marginalized over the past several decades, and use new systems to advance equality. On the global stage, 69 countries, LGBTQ identity and or same-sex conduct is criminalized. In 9 countries, you could face the death penalty for being LGBTQ. We have to change that. How do we change that? Cultural change. I'm in the business of cultural change. And that means doing this work on the ground, engaging with people day in and day out to make sure that when we get to that place that we say liberation, that liberation is actually sustainable. And so I'm optimistic that we have an opportunity to do that over the next 5 to 10 years.
And so the final question to you is the traditional final question of these bridge builder conversations. And that is inviting each speaker to offer a call to action, a charge to each person in the audience to learn more or do something that adds to the bridge that together we are building to the future. Alphonso David, President of the Human Rights Campaign, what is your call to action for our audience tonight?
Can I have 3?
Hey, you got 4 minutes. 4 so go right ahead.
3 calls to action. 1, see beyond yourself, please. Find a way to see beyond yourself. See beyond the policy issue that directly affects you. See beyond the benefits that you get directly. See beyond yourself if you can. Put yourself in my shoes, Black, gay, immigrant, and see how policies that you may be supporting are not directly affecting me, or if they are, they're not affecting me positively. So please see how you can see beyond yourself. Second, if you're not involved, please get involved. Visit hrc.org. You can learn more about our work and you can get involved. You can volunteer, you can support, you can engage in general advocacy. And the last, I would say, if you haven't done this, please contact your congressional representative, your senator, and encourage them to support and vote for the Equality Act. I've been drumming the Equality Act because it will change the lives of millions of people in this country. And we have an opportunity to do that with the Biden-Harris administration and hopefully with 2 seats that we will get from the state of Georgia. So I'm hoping that we will get the Equality Act passed this law. But in order to do that, people need to hear from their representatives. So please contact them and express support for the Equality Act.
And with that, again, everyone, you've just seen and listened to a person who I greatly admire, a leader, not just in the LGBTQ community, but a leader in our country. And one of the people who has been one of the reasons why I've been hopeful especially over these last 4 years, that the future of this country is bright and in good hands. Alphonso David, President of the Human Rights Campaign, thank you very much for being here. Clinton Foundation, thank you very much for having us be a part of this Bridge Builders program.
Jonathan, thanks for having me. Clinton Foundation and Stephanie, thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.